And then we'll just wait just a couple of minutes because we know we have this technological issue that was going on with people trying to access. So just want to make sure everybody can get on that wants to get on. And our apologies if you have had some challenges getting in. We had an Eventbrite Zoom issue that created two webinars with two different numbers. And so we had to pick one. And it seems that maybe we picked the wrong one. So our apologies if you were in the other one and received a notification that the event number was not working. We are trying to make sure everybody has the proper information so they can get on. So maybe a couple more minutes just to let folks get logged in and get that sorted. Yay, technology. Always a fun time. Always something, I feel like. If it's not one thing, it's something else.
Yeah, and and you can tell me to quirk because I'm an optimist to a point of annoyance. If our kids and families happy and healthy, these are first world problems.
Absolutely.
I was riding the chair at Stowe a couple weeks ago, and people were complaining about the $30 parking charge. And I looked at them and said, "Sounds like you have some great problems."
Yeah. Yep. All right. Here come the people. All right. This is good.
Excellent.
Folks are finding their way in. Again, our technological issue, Eventbrite and Zoom created two webinar meetings. And so we had to cancel one, and I think we picked the wrong one to cancel based on just purely numbers. So thank you, and we're glad that you're finding us over here. We are recording this, so if you're hearing after the fact, I will get this up as quick as possible. So if people wanted to attend and couldn't because of the registration issue, they can do that sooner rather than later. So.
Well, Angela, on that note, maybe we should begin. And everybody who's on, we can't stress enough. Please feel free to, to ask questions throughout. We have a gentleman who's going to, share a very interesting fraud story. My name is Brian Armstrong. I'm both the CEO of Keller Williams Vermont, as well as operating principal of Strongwell Property Management and the Strongwell Real Estate team at KW. Angela Zakowski is one of my favorite people. She fights hard for the rights of landlords who are getting out there, taking risks, providing service to the public. Today, when I thought of this, I've been trained, Angela, that if we have a problem in our professional lives,
Yep.
we're missing a system or a who. And I often joke with property management clients and real estate clients, if you allow me to share the mistakes and the fail forwards that I made over the last 25, 30 years in this business, I can save you a lot of money. And when I think of tenant selection, I think of two things. I think, what an honor and an obligation it is to help provide housing in our community. And also, we have a responsibility. So maybe it's three things to our other residents to pick great neighbors.
Yep.
And then also, how can we balance giving back? Because everybody needs a chance every now and then. And with humor, giving back in a controlled way. So when I think of this, and I'm about to hand it over to you, I think more often than not, great landlords are missing great systems around tenant screening, and they often go with their gut. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But let's see what we can do to share some systems and bring some value and hopefully peace
Sure.
amongst our properties.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. Look, we did a little agenda. Like, we're getting really fancy. We can't seem to manage to work Eventbrite or Zoom, but we got you a PowerPoint here. So we're going to talk a little bit about advertising, because that's one area where landlords and property managers can get tripped up from a fair housing standpoint. We're going to talk about the rental application. We're going to talk about selecting qualified applicants and then things to be aware of. David, just giving you a little heads up, we'll unmute you so you can share your story during that section. And then we have some final thoughts. And if we have time, I'll give a little legislative update.
Beautiful.
All right. So advertising. Oops, what is going on there? So tenant selection, and it starts with your advertisement, right? And so one of the big questions or issues that folks could run into now is the number of platforms that are available to advertise on is really high. And there is not really the screening that used to happen when you were just advertising with newspapers. So what do I mean by that? When advertisements were going into newspapers, the newspapers were also giving it a screen for fair housing things. Because a few newspapers got whacked early on for violating fair housing. And so they started also looking at advertisements. So if you had something in there that could be a potential violation or wasn't allowed, they would come back to you and say, we can't run this, you need to change it. But with the platforms like Craigslist, Airbnb, apartments.com, Zillow, like all of these, there's not that intermediate level and layer of advertisement review. And so I think, it's good as a reminder to just be really aware of fair housing issues as you're placing your advertisements. And so the big one in this category is to make sure that you're describing the property and the unit, but not the person you want to rent to. So where landlords start running afoul of fair housing is when they start putting descriptors in that would describe or could describe the type of person that they want to rent to. So, I mean, this could be something as really obvious as perfect for a couple, right? So that's not allowed in advertising.
Mhm.
It's a clear fair housing issue. Um, but something even like quiet neighborhood could run you afoul of fair housing because it would suggest to somebody if they have children that they might not be allowed or not be welcome because quiet neighborhood suggests that it's not something that would be welcoming for people with children. If any of you have children, you know they are very loud. They are not quiet humans. So, and this becomes challenging as these advertising platforms aren't screening for these fair housing phrases. Another one that can run into problems for landlords is no pets, no exceptions. So it's okay to say you don't allow pets, but you can't then qualify that with the no exceptions because that would mean you wouldn't allow a reasonable accommodation for that no pets policy in your advertisement. So
Angela, one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is, and I want to say this diplomatically, if somebody is owner occupied and is it 2 units or is it 4 units or less, they have a little
three
bit more,
units, three
three
units.
units or less. They have a little bit more freedom of selection.
So it's interesting that you brought that up in the advertising section, Brian, because they have freedom from selection. So they could base their decision on something that falls within a protected class, but you can't say that's why you did it or you can't
Got it.
advertise it. So can't speak it, and speaking is included in advertising. But you can think it and you can base your decision on it. You just can't tell anybody that that's what you did. It's this weird circular legal thing that so
Excellent.
really, even if you're in that 3 units or less, it's better to just follow fair housing rules and be in compliance with them because you can't share that that's what you're doing anyway if there's a protected class that you don't want in that property. Um, so sort of getting back to advertisements, and we won't spend a huge amount of time on this. This is really sort of landlord and property management 101 is, stick to the facts. What's the rent? What's included in that rent? Does it include utilities? Does it include all utilities, some utilities? Is there parking available? Does parking come at an extra charge? Do you allow pets? But remember, you can say no pets, but don't qualify it with no pets, no exceptions. That one will get you into trouble with fair housing. Is it a non-smoking property? Or is there smoking allowed outside? How many bedrooms is this unit? And then sort of what's the location? But I think, the takeaway is people can do their own research with that neighborhood or with that area, and does it, work well for them? Again, be careful with those descriptors that might make somebody feel, oh, I can't rent there because they said it's perfect for quiet people or perfect for persons with small children. I don't know. That's sort of like the reverse
Mhm.
discrimination. So
One of the things in real estate we often deal with too is we're told, to be careful of phrases like easy walk,
Right.
because it
Yep.
may imply, it may imply that you're prejudiced against somebody who may be physically challenged.
Right. Right. And so I think, that's why, sticking to describing the unit, what's included in the rent, what are people getting for the amount that you're asking? And then what do you require to apply? Application required, is a credit check required, background checks required, like those pieces of information. The showing of the unit is going to allow people to see what whether it's going to work for them or not. And I know some landlords and property managers have gone to virtual tours. So they have those available so people can walk through the units before they even come see it in person, to get a sense. Like that's another good tool, because the person can do that on their own time. So, all right. So tenant screening, the big sort of nuts and bolts here. Um, the big one is to have a process and stick to it, right? So Brian, that's sort of your uh, processes and controls,
Absolutely.
and to make sure that you follow it every time, and don't deviate. It's okay to change your process if something's inefficient or not working, but you need to be able to document, this is why I changed, this is how I'm doing it now. And this becomes particularly important if a fair housing complaint's made against you, saying, you treated somebody differently or you didn't rent to them because they're in this protected class. Having this process, having the documentation to show, nope, this is what I've done every time. Now, that could be a problem if what you've done every time is a fair housing violation, but that's a different issue. And one that maybe requires a different conversation. But for the most part, landlords are looking at sort of specific things that aren't related to fair housing violations. So, um, and my two big takeaways always with this is show the rental to anybody who wants to see it, right? Try not to pre-screen folks on like a phone call or an email. If somebody wants to come look at the unit, show them the unit. And then always provide an application to anybody who wants one. So, those two things at this tenant initial contact point will reduce fair housing violations significantly.
Permission to challenge.
Absolutely.
Now, I know one property manager actually asked people, "Have you reviewed all the pictures online?"
Hmm.
Now, their opinion is, hey, if you haven't reviewed the pictures online, I don't want to initially set up the time to show you the unit because you haven't really looked at it.
Yep.
Would that concern you as one of our representatives, or if that was basically something they did for everybody, is that something you would consider okay?
What if somebody was visually impaired and couldn't look at the pictures online?
I rest. Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I mean, I
Appreciate
think,
it. Yeah.
I think the answer is possibly, but you have to be mindful that there might be a reason why
Mhm.
somebody couldn't look at those pictures online. Maybe they don't have access to the website. They're just calling around, so they don't have a way to look at them. So, I'd be careful of something like that, because it could create a problem. I'm not saying it's going to, but just it's possible. Um,
Yeah, we've got actually a great question. Yana, always great to have you on. Thank you for your time today. Yana actually asked another interesting perspective, which I know both in property management on the real estate side has been top of our radar recently. Is definitely have a question about agent safety and showings without getting any info. So, for
right.
example, the Northwestern Vermont Board of Realtors had provided as part of their benefits a background app called Forewarn.
Hmm.
And under the premise that, hey, if you're going to go out and show a property to somebody, you might want to run them through this background app, which is not a perfect background app. Caught all my speeding tickets, uh but and there's a lot of them. What are your thoughts about the other perspective, property managers, landlords going to meet people, especially in the
Um,
winter when it's dark early?
exactly. And I think, those are all things to be aware of. Some landlords and property managers are using open house type settings where there's an hour or two window and you can control when that is. I think you could also control how and when groups are shown. Maybe you don't show to just a single group. Maybe
Great
you
point.
have two groups who are interested and you take them through, or you show with a partner. So there's two of you there to go through. But I think, being mindful of your safety is paramount. And that goes for after the tenants are in the building as well. Like, you could potentially have some of those same concerns even when people are living there. So it's fair to be mindful. A landlord could have a process where they say, we need the application filled out first, and then once we have the application, we'll show you the apartment. That could get dicey because
Mm.
maybe the person doesn't want to apply or have that application in once they've seen the apartment. You're sort of in this chicken and egg kind of scenario. But I think, folks just being mindful of their surroundings, who they're meeting, and, having another person there with them, or having more than one group at a time that you're scheduling could alleviate some of those concerns.
The other thing I'll add to that, Angela, too, is the open houses are great for if there's existing tenants, because while on
Right,
one hand it gets more people through at once, it's less interruptions.
right,
So that's a great point.
right. Um, so open houses, you could also use a calendaring tool. So you could send the prospective applicant a link that has open and available times, and then they can pick one that fits with their schedule as well. So we have technology now to make this as easy as possible. The other one that's not on here is the virtual tours. And I think there are at least one, if not two, property management companies that have gone almost exclusively to
Mhm.
virtual tours because they're relatively easy to access. You get a good look. They can have them set up for when there's not tenant stuff in the unit. So they're done in between tenant changeovers. And it allows the person to literally walk through the unit on their own time. So that is another tool that's available that's not overly expensive to do for particular units. All right. So the application. Um, so you always want to use a written rental application. And if you're not, we should check in after, because you really should be using one. Sort of gone are the days of like the handshake and yeah, I know your family. I will rent to you. Not a good idea. You want to have information in hand in case there's a problem, but also, I think, as Brian alluded to, for potentially the protection of other people in the building. So, all right. So just some actual basics for things that you want to ask or can ask. And this would apply for anybody who's over 18 and going to be living in the unit 18 or older. You want their name, and that's their full name, probably their legal name, not like their nickname, but what's like on their driver's license or passport, their current address. You definitely want some form of photo ID to just confirm that the person who's standing in front of you, and this is why we'll get to a little later, these in-person in-person meetings are important. Is the person that you're meeting, the person on the ID, match the person on the application? It's important, and we're going to hear a story in a little bit about a situation like that, and then also rental history. So you usually want 2 to 3 years, or at least two landlord references. I always say you don't want the place where they're living right now. You want the one prior to that, because the one prior to that's going to give you the absolute truth of how that tenant was. The one now may have, if they're in litigation or in an eviction, they may have some restrictions or not feel like they can say anything. So, definitely you want more than one with that.
And Angela, we had a great question. I know we're going to hear from David about his challenge. So I'll add a couple things. And as always, cut me off if I'm not being politically correct or not, recommending good advice. But one of the most powerful things I think we can all do, which I don't believe violates fair housing in any way or form, is Google the person,
Mm-hmm.
look at their social, media. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean social media if they're doing, like you're vegetarian and they're smoking brisket, but more vegetarian if you see, or excuse me, if you're looking at social media and you're seeing lots of partying pictures, drug pictures, tons of alcohol, loud music, stuff like that.
Yep.
A real quick story on that one. Years ago, I had a unit. We had a handicap ramp. My mother raised me right, had a very well spoken individual that was physically challenged, rented to them because we felt, hey, they were nice, they were well spoken, felt bad that they were in a tough situation. And about a month into it, I got complaints that they were allergic to the barbecue grill smoke, that I turned off, that I had turned off their heat, only to find out from Vermont Gas they had never had a service call. And then I
Mm-hmm.
Googled this person's name and I found an 11-page handwritten deposition to the 11th District Court in Arizona accusing Radio Shack and Sprint of stealing the contacts out of this person's phone and harassing them.
Yeah.
And if I had, just checked Google before I rented to this person, I would have found that. And that was an 18-month saga to get the person out that I was accused of killing a service dog for delivering non-pet friendly rock salt. I think you've
Yep.
heard the story before. I had a 54-page investigation from the Vermont Human Rights Association, unanimous vindication. Brian did nothing wrong. But had I Googled this person, I would have never rented to them.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's amazing what you can find on the internet these days.
Yeah, and that, too, is Benjamin Brown. He asked the question, for those renting for the first time, are there cautions to look for before showing the rental? Angela, to me, I'd love to hear your 2 cents. Google, social media, even asking some just, some questions he asked, to everybody, such as maybe, hey, we run credit, bureaus on everybody, we run background checks, Mr. and Mrs., Smith, how will those turn out for us?
Yep. Yeah. Um at times I struggle with recommending sort of this pre-screening, and I understand the balance between, safety of folks showing the units and wanting to manage sort of an influx of information, and requests, right? Because the market's flooded right now. You have an open unit. A lot of folks are getting a very high volume. And trying to parse through that and deal with that is challenging. Um, I have seen a number of complaints made against landlords and property managers when they try to pre-screen, because inevitably they're asking something or something comes up in that conversation, that creates the ability of the applicant to make a fair housing claim when they're denied. And so it could be something super innocuous when you're doing those pre-screening questions. But then later down the road, when you say no, the complaint comes back, well, it was because of this thing I told you in pre-screening, and you already were made up your mind, like it didn't matter, and it's because of that thing, not because of anything else that happened after that. And part of the reason is because with those pre-screening, we don't see a very high level of documentation. So a lot of times it's done on the fly, it's done, on the phone, it's notes aren't kept. And so when the accusation comes back, the landlord or property manager just doesn't have the data. They can't remember. It was, from months ago or even weeks
Exactly.
ago, even if it was last week, like you talked to so many people, you can't remember. And so that's part of the problem with those pre-screens.
And so
So
I'm thinking like sex offenders registry and all that. But I guess also what I'm
yeah,
hearing is A, be caution about pre-screening. But what I'm also reading between the lines, if you're doing it, do it for everybody,
yep.
follow the system,
Hmm.
possibly even create a checklist and write down the name, check this, check this. So you have a proven system that if questioned,
Yep.
it's the results of the system, not what they said or what you felt.
Right. Right. And the other area where folks get into trouble is sometimes they try to do those pre-screens for emails, which then you do have a documented proof, but you have to make sure that you're hitting every email.
Mhm.
So if you're not responding back to an email that has given you information that is maybe something that you wouldn't, someone you might not be interested in renting to, you're making a prejudgment call based on that. And you could also be being tested.
Mhm.
So just remember there's testers out there related to
Absolutely.
fair housing. And so they'll send you inquiries that are the same, except one little piece of information is different. Like I have an assistance animal, or I am a single mom with kids, but everything else is exactly the same. And so they're checking to see, are these people getting the same response? Of
Right.
information, timeliness, like, so, if you're hearing us sort of beat this drum about treat everybody the same, respond the same, do the same thing, this is why. Because that's that consistency that can get you out of um, a fair housing issue. It's not going to stop the complaint from coming in.
Mhm.
Let's be clear. It's not going to stop the complaint, but it will allow you to defend that complaint in a much easier fashion. So, other things to make sure you're including on applications are vehicle information, or finding out do people have vehicles, what's going to happen with parking. That can become important if like people are parking more vehicles, or you're getting into a vehicle towing situation, but you need to know how many vehicles does this particular unit have. What are the sources of income? And you notice two things on the list are bolded and have a little asterisk
I was
next to it.
curious.
Yeah, right. So sources of income and criminal history. So these are both things that you can ask about, but you also want to proceed with caution, um, because sources of income is everything, right? It's not just W-2 wages. It's not just sort of traditional income. It could be some sort of government benefits. It could be a housing voucher. It could be, um, parental help. Like those are all sources of income, and those all have to be considered equally. So be careful how you're phrasing that. So it's not just what's your job, it's, where are your sources of income, right? Because it's much broader than just traditional wages. And with criminal history, you can still say no if people have criminal records, but you have to have done a little bit more digging to find out what's the violation, what was the issue, and make a call based on that little bit more investigative work. So it's not enough to just be like, oh, this person has a criminal record. The answer is no. Well,
So I
and
couldn't be turned away for the 20 speeding tickets I've accumulated in the last 20 years.
I mean, it's possible. But again, right, that's and speeding tickets are a weird, like civil violation. They don't
Mhm.
really generally rise to the level of criminal history. But the reason
That's enough.
why, right, the reason why this has a little asterisk next to it is in lots of other places, um, there have been a lot of studies and a lot of reports that show that persons of color get pulled over and criminally pulled over by police,
Okay.
and subsequently criminally cited at a higher rate than their non persons of color counterparts. So they're white. So they are more likely to have a criminal record than folks who are not persons of color. And so there's a layer of um, discrimination within the criminal justice system, or at least advocates are trying to point to that. And so they say it has legally what's called a disparate impact. So if you are a person of color, you are more disparately impacted because you're a person of color and are more likely to have a criminal record. So you need to look further into that criminal history and figure out what it is before making a decision. Or you could be running afoul of fair housing. Um, it if it sounds really complicated and sort of like, wait, what did she just say? It is because it is very complicated, and fair housing is probably one of the most complicated areas of the law that you have to navigate. So let me give you an example. So there was a case out of Texas, and a lot of these cases come from other places, not coming from Vermont, where um, a person of Hispanic descent had a DUI charge that was from like 20 years ago. Never had anything since then. but was continually denied from public housing and other housing providers due to that criminal charge. And so the allegation was made, it's not the criminal charge. They're using that as a pretext. They just don't want to rent to me because I am of Hispanic descent. And that case went up, I think it went all the way to the US Supreme Court. And they agreed that it was being used as a pretext because of the length of time that had passed from that criminal charge, what the criminal charge was, and that there had been nothing since then. So it wasn't sort of a pattern of behavior. It was like a one-off, but it was being used against this person like 20 years later. So that's why I asterisk those. So you can still deny people based on criminal history. You just have to go a little layer below.
The other thing I'm hearing too is, once again, have a system and
Right,
have a system to go not only later below, but I would challenge any property owner and certainly any property manager to possibly be put in your guidelines or procedures manual what type of convictions are allowed and not allowed. Personally,
right.
my 2 cents is most people on this earth, deserve a second chance. Most, not all.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd have greater concerns with violent felonies, armed robbery, assault,
Right,
sexual predation,
right,
versus speeding tickets or, one or two DWs. Not fans of that, but
right,
this
right.
earth is about, once again, a system and
Right.
guidelines.
Exactly. And I think, that fair housing case related to the criminal charge would have been a different outcome if that 20-year-old charge was, say, a murder charge and the person had been in jail the last 20 years and just got out. Like, that could have been a different outcome versus a DUI charge from 20 years ago and nothing since. So, um, also pets. But again, we get into fair housing issues related to pets and reasonable accommodations, and that is an entirely different seminar.
And this may be a great time to hear from James Unsworth about the fraud situation. But the thing that pops up with eviction history, and I know this is, I think you said a couple webinars ago, it might be changing. Years ago, I rented to somebody and they said, when we were evicting them with a sheriff, they said, "Hey, I'm surprised you rented today." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, I just got evicted right before, right before you rented to me." Called up my son, who's my business partner, and we did the whole court search, excuse me, a credit bureau. And that's when I learned from you that at the time, I think this was 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, that the Vermont court system had stopped reporting evictions. So I challenge anybody here not only to run credit bureaus, and we should talk about what to look for and what not to, and for a second on those,
And I
but
have some
listen to the tech
information
bureau.
of how people can
Excellent.
access those court records because they're
Beautiful.
becoming a lot easier everything's been moving to online and electronic. So it's getting quite a bit easier. And also emergency contacts. This is one that whether you put it in the lease or whether you put it on the application, this is good information to have. So if you decide to rent to this person and they just go missing one day, it happens. You want those emergency contacts so you have somebody you can try to get in touch with to be like, hey, I can't, I'm trying to get a hold of Brian. He's my tenant. Do you know where he might be? I haven't been able to get in touch with him for a couple of weeks. Like, so you can put it on the rental application, you can put it on the lease, but you should have it somewhere. All right. Credit checks and background checks. This little QR code right here on the screen will take you to the court portal, the public portal, that will allow you to search eviction records. So I think this is probably a good time to unmute James and let him share their story.
Mr. Unsworth, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Awesome. So, this was an interesting one for us. I've been doing this for 10 years. David McGee, who works in our office, has been doing this for the better part of 2 decades. And this was some pretty brazen fraud. We own an apartment complex in Burlington, listed on Zillow, listed on a couple of spots, and he set up a showing. The gentleman showed up. seemed a little antsy, just a little skittish is how David described it. Showed him the units. It all went okay. We got the application in. Everything was fraudulent about the application. They listed their current address as a Champlain Housing Trust building, but the telephone number was for the Burlington Travel Lodge. David called the Travel Lodge. Nobody had heard of him. He called Champlain Housing Trust. Nobody had heard from him. He gave some other personal references. Nobody was associated with the addresses or the numbers there. The application came through Zillow, where he falsified pay stubs. The employer had never heard of this person and doesn't do business in Vermont. And the credit report was obviously belonging to someone else. The previous addresses were luxury apartments in New York and Atlanta. Also, when we went to run the credit, it was a frozen credit. Everything about this, the application was also written in two different handwritings, which was very obvious. It was so clear that this was fraud that our very first person we told this to was our esteemed attorney, Angela Zykowski, because we were so taken back by how brazen this was. And I mean, and I'd be willing to hear from whoever, but I'm not even sure what the end game is. I don't know what they were trying to get out of us. It was just very surprising.
Right. And it may be that they were just that desperate or in need of housing, but it feels like it's a lot of work to go through to get housing. I mean, we've all heard about the scams on Craigslist and other places where people are spoofing rentals with their information and then taking deposits and first month's rent from folks when they're not actually the landlord or renting the apartment. So I would agree, James, the end game here is a little strange, except it could just be the person's trying to get housing and thinks, well, this is the way I'm going to do it. And I'm going to ride this out till they evict me, 6,
Yeah.
9, 12 months later.
And it's strange. We get our listings spoofed on a pretty regular basis where somebody will just copy and paste and do that scam as you're talking about. But this
Yep.
was the inverse of that, and it just was a real head scratcher.
Yep.
While you guys have foolishly allowed me to talk, I
Oh,
did just want Brian's
We can mute
comment.
you.
Yeah.
Just keep going.
Brian's comment about just Googling somebody is so important, I think. You run all of these credit checks, you run these background checks. The internet, you can't erase anything off the internet. And admittedly, I really just manage our commercial portfolio. But when I have been looking for a prospective commercial tenant, that's started to be the first thing I do is who is this person? And I just don't think that can be downplayed as a resource.
yeah, absolutely. And so I have splashed up here some additional no charge sources of information. So credit checks come with a cost generally. Background checks come with a cost, and you notice that I have a bullet point in here that says who pays for them is currently in dispute. So this is a new emerging issue. It's also possibly going to be dealt with down at the legislature. So as we came out of the COVID moratorium, Legal Aid decided that they were going to interpret the no application fees statute in an entirely new fashion. So that statute's been on the books for as long as I've been doing this, which is 20 years at this point. And it has always meant that you couldn't just have a charge for people to apply. It has never meant that you couldn't collect an actual cost to a third party, like a credit check or a background check. That has not how that statute has ever been interpreted till recently. So Legal Aid has decided that that means you can't charge at all. Some landlords and property management companies have gotten letters from Legal Aid about these fees, and they've also taken it to the legislature. So they've asked the legislature to modify the application fee statute to make it clear that it also includes no credit checks and no background check fees. So there has been some testimony taken on that. I don't know where that's going to go, but we will be keeping an eye on it because it could be a big change if something like that goes into effect. It's not going to do away with the credit checks. I think it's probably just going to change how landlords do them. But it's going to have a financial impact, and I think it's going to have a financial impact on tenants in the long run. Most of these decisions and changes end up impacting tenants negatively in the long run, and that's sort of the short-sightedness of many of these changes we see at the legislature. So
three things come to mind, Angela.
yeah.
One is, another quick little story. We had, a property manager met an entire, and I hope this violates fair housing, entire family, extremely supportive family for the applicant. Just seemed like an all around great situation, involved parents, so forth and so on. That ended up, unfortunately, also being an example. If we'd Googled the person, we would have not rented them. Unfortunately, a child was injured in that unit because of their parent that we would have caught on. And this is going back years. For the
Right.
records, folks, we've adopted these systems now that, knock on wood, when we screened, I think we had 1 or 2 evictions in the last year from the own tenants that we picked because of this. Now, the other thing that comes to mind, I'm a former loan officer. When I was self-renting our properties, I wouldn't look at it with the eyes of a loan officer because, let's be frank, if they're paying $1,500 to $2,000 or even $3,000 because prices are going up, at least in Gotham, Burlington, they could possibly buy a house. So I don't look for it. This is my own personal 2 cents. I don't look for every credit card, car, stuff like that to be paid perfectly. But where I dive into is the public record search. Do they have utility discharges? And the reason the utility discharges, which goes back to another system that you and I have talked about before, if they have a charge off with Green Mountain Power or Vermont Gas, good luck having them set the utilities in their name.
Right.
So I would really look at utility charge offs. Plus, it's also an indication of how they take care of their priorities. Now, the system that's off of our topic today, briefly, is I would make sure, folks, if you're renting units that they're paying the utilities, the moment you sign the lease, you call that utility provider and say, James and Brian are moving in on the 1st of March. Please turn off the heat and the electricity out of my company's name on the 29th. Because if they move in and get stuff established and you haven't checked, all of a sudden they have utilities in your name, and it will be, Angela, correct me if I'm wrong, illegal for you to turn them off.
That's correct. So you want to make sure that that switchover happens. So we've given you all of this information, all of these things to think about. And so how do you select that qualified tenant? I'm going to tell you that this screen is blank. We left it blank on purpose because Brian and I are going to chat through a few things with you, but this is also where you have to decide where are those parameters for you. We can't tell you that. We can give you some guardrails, but this is part of this development of a system and process, and then following that system and process. So what are the important things for you as a landlord? Do you want, when you're looking at sources of income to tenants' ability to pay, do you want to have a percentage of where that income has to fall compared to what the monthly rent is? It's okay if you do, you just have to apply it consistently, and you have to apply it to all sources of income. Do you, like Brian says, if you're looking at a credit check, do you exclude medical collections? Do you exclude student loan collections? Are you just looking for things like civil judgments, eviction judgments, unpaid utilities? Again, sort of, what is your tolerance level for looking at a person's debt or credit history? It's not going to be, it's going to be messy. There's very few people out there that have sort of perfect credit, particularly if they're renting. So what are your tolerance levels? What are the things that are the no-goes, right? The absolutely not, if we see this is a no. And just make sure that those things don't fall into a fair housing category. But these are the sort of parameters that you have to set. What are the landlord reference situation? Do you require certain things that you're hearing from landlords? Whether this person's a good neighbor, do they get along? Do they pay their rent on time? knowing that you may get a partial story or you may not get the full story from a landlord. You know, what is your online Google search? What if you've what kinds of things are you looking for out there, right? The news story where somebody, actually this came across in my weekly newsletter from Bar Council. So we get little tidbits like, hey, for like ethics stuff, like here's an interesting story, here's something you might want to be aware of. So apparently an attorney somewhere was at a concert, got really excited, stripped down naked, and ran up onto the stage. And in the process, I guess hurt somebody, ran somebody over doing that. And so the attorney got sued. And but you know, if you find a story like that, does that make that person a bad tenant? Like, you know, I don't know. Like, where's your tolerance for out of the unit behavior, right? Because there's so much information out there on people.
Angela, we've got a great question that pertains to this, and I've got a thought, but I'll read the question. And Dan, thank you for joining us today. About Google searching screening, can you discuss how to, why not to confront the applicant about what you found and how to use this info in your screening documentation? You know, one thought, you know, Andrew, please, and I'll share my thought. Please
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, go, please go.
So one, we got a text from James, said that happened at a Fish concert.
Yes,
So
it did.
that's funny. So here would be my, you know, initial 2 cents, and you tell me for parameters. One is make sure that you look through a series of, you know, things, because we have people that have similar names. We have, you know, similar zip codes. There's another Brian Armstrong somewhere in Vermont, you know, so I would challenge you to look for multiple sources of the same piece of information before you assume that one result depicts, in this case with humor, Brian Armstrong.
Right.
That's the other thing I would say to the person too, is look for 2 to 3 other verifications. So if you see something on Google, I'll just pull it out of the sky. Well, actually, let's use your case. You had a streaker at a Fish concert. Now, if you see something on social media that verifies excessive drug use or alcohol use or stuff like that, that would sort of align with what you found on Google. So I'd almost say try to verify in 2 or 3 sources, possibly 2 or 3 different medias as well, and then ultimately challenge your gut. I would personally just make sure, if you talk to the person about it, that, again, and this is something I've really grown from today, you do that with every applicant. For example, one sort of trick I was taught, you know, 20, 30 years ago is, if I was going to take a chance on a tenant, go visit them at their current residence. Say, hey, James, you know, I need to get this, you know, credit background check permission signed. Let me stop by your house, see how they were, you know, cleaning, how they kept the place. But what I grew from the day, thank you, Angela, is if I did that to James, I better consider doing that to every other person out there.
Right. Right. It's that sort of equal treatment. It's hard when you're talking about disclosing information or explaining to somebody why you're making the decision that you are. I think it's okay to follow up and maybe ask for more information, but again, it's that consistency. So you have to do that across the line. And not just be trying to qualify the person that maybe you want to rent to, right? So you have to be careful how you do it. But it can also, if you don't like the explanation that you're given, or you're given something that's a reasonable explanation for what you bring to them, you also have to be prepared to take that and include it in your analysis. So it's not, I have this thing and I'm going to ask you about it, but I'm not going to listen to what the answer is because I've already made up my mind. So if you're going to ask the question, then you need to be prepared for the information that's coming back, and you may need to be prepared to reevaluate your position based on the information that comes back from this person. So you can, I think it, you know, it depends on why you're doing it, or you know, what you're trying to accomplish by doing it. And just always in the back of your head be like, am I creating a fair housing problem for myself by doing this?
You bring up a great point. The other thought that popped in my head is, what is the, were there any other events like that, and how long ago that was?
Right,
With humor, I'm going to guess
right,
anybody who's really lived on this session today has possibly been in a place they've had a little too much, they said a little bit too much, and if that happened to be captured on camera, is that indicative of James, Angela, Brian, or was
right,
this just a one-off?
right,
Um, and the other thing, what I'm growing from today is I'm going to go back and ask that we identify the convictions as a property management company that we generally will consider, and those convictions
right.
that we will not consider.
Right. And I think, again, that's one of those things that you need to decide again, which of those are no-goes and which ones are okay, right? There could be some criminal history or criminal charges that are a pass or that aren't going to disqualify somebody from your rental. And there's some that will. And some people rent to folks coming out of the Department of Corrections. And so it's a different model or a different type of tenant. So you have to just uh, decide where your level is and what you want in your building. Um, and again, I think keeping in mind with what Brian said is also, you're a housing provider, you're providing a service. And you're trying to house people in the best way possible while managing all of these competing interests. And sometimes people do deserve second chances. So it's
I would challenge folks, if they're turning people away, unless it's like really clear things, violent felonies, stuff like that, take some time and give some money to charity, because we all need a second chance. Now, whether we do that charity with humor in our buildings,
mm,
or whether we take that karma that we didn't give somebody a chance, because Vermont's eviction process is really tough right now.
mm-hmm. Yep.
And then with humor, and I'll say this may be politically correct. If somebody shows up with a stack of 20s in their hand, I'm gonna be I'm gonna be concerned about the source of income. Maybe that's the most politically correct way to say it in this
Yes.
day and age.
Well, and if you're using the rental application, it's going to ask for what the source of income is. So, you know, but the scams are getting savvy, right? They're folks are looking for places to go. They're looking for places to come in to set up shop, to engage in behaviors that we don't want to see here. So we know folks are coming from other places, moving in with tenants or trying to establish their own units for drug-related sales and drug-related issues. So, again, the stack of cash, while not across the board, some people still work in cash businesses. Most of them are not legitimate. So, again, it's finding, asking those questions, having that consistent process will help screen out a number of folks. Is it perfect? No, it's not. There's no 100% foolproof here. It's doing the best you can with the information that you have and are able to access. So.
Angela, it's 12:54. I know, final thoughts is perfect. And I know some people, if you have any more questions, hopefully this is a value, and we always appreciate the questions. And if we have an extra minute, I'd love to hear from Angela. What's going on? We got town meeting coming up, and what should we be doing to advocate, for our fellow housing providers?
Yes, absolutely. So final thoughts on this particular issue is to take your time. Don't let people rush you. Don't let applicants rush you. Don't be afraid of an empty unit. The eviction process currently for something as straightforward as non-payment of rent is a 30-day notice and probably a 4 to 6 month court process. So do not be afraid of that empty unit. It's far better to let it sit for a month or two till you find the perfect tenant or more perfect tenant than to rent to the wrong person or the person who's not going to pay or treat the property with respect. So in terms of legislative things coming up, Montpelier is the main one right now that's doing a charter change vote for just cause eviction framework. Their just cause ordinance or proposed ordinance looks very similar to Burlington's. The other places that have already passed those charter changes, they're stalled out in the legislature right now. So Burlington, Essex, Winooski, those three are currently sitting in legislative committee, and the word we're getting is that they probably are not going to move those the legislative committee is probably not going to move those, but that can change sort of in a heartbeat. So as of right now, nothing's being put forward on those at the legislative issue. But by far and away, the simpler method is to not even let it get past that. Brattleboro did a fabulous job of combating the local charter change request for just cause, and it was voted down at the local level, so it didn't even make it past that step. I will say the number of bills that are having testimony taken on them are not landlord friendly. There seems to be this sense that we have a housing crisis, so instead of focusing on how do we get more units online, which would really solve the problem, we're going to focus on how to regulate landlords more to fix a problem that maybe one or two tenants are having. And because that will make us feel good that we've done something. I can't quite figure out what the reasoning behind this is, but I've seen bills for this application fee situation, temporary moratorium on no cause notices. That one is sort of baffling. So it'd just be like a year moratorium on no cause. There's a bill related to reciprocal attorney's fees and leases. So that one says if the landlord has an attorney's fees provision in their lease, that it would automatically become reciprocal, meaning that the prevailing party in an eviction action would be entitled to their attorney's fees, which is sort of a complete divergence from how this relationship is operated before now. And I just had a new one come across my desk related to EV chargers for electric vehicles at rental properties. So that's a new one that's, I think we may start hearing more about, if not this year, but in the future. So
Three thoughts that popped
yeah,
in my head, and everybody, if you get any final questions, we really appreciate the attendance today, considering you also had, again, Eventbrite and Zoom challenges, is first and foremost, folks, we've all got to speak up. I think
yes,
secondly, and Angela, if your email box gets blown up, I apologize, but I would email Angela at vtlandlord.com, possibly if you're willing to testifying. Angela, I hope you call me. I'd be happy to make the time. And the other thing I think is if we're talking about these bills, folks, we've got to put it in context because let's be frank, just cause sounds like an easy thing if you know a friend is having trouble getting housing to squash. But when you put it in context, Vermont has a 4 to 6 month eviction process. I've got a friend who's a landlord in Florida, and I think he can get people out in like 21 to 30 days.
yep,
Now, 21 to 30 days, I could see it probably be good to balance it by taking off just costs. But with 4 to 6 months, and we all know if
right,
you're, if Jane Smith's concerned that her neighbor is a drug dealer, chances of Jane Smith saying, "Hey, Brian, I'll go to court with you and tell that James Unworth is peddling X," that's just not going to happen.
right.
So put it in context when you're talking with legislators. We have a 4 to 6 month eviction process, unlike Florida and other states that are 3 to 4 weeks.
Right. We use no cause notices as a way to protect other tenants in the building. We use it so they don't have to come in to testify. Many times they're
That
scared of their safety. Um,
soundbite to use.
yes. So these, share stories, but be careful. Don't be negative towards tenants. Really keep the focus on like your own experiences. This is, how I've used this notice and why, and how it's protected other tenants in my building. But the same with anything. This is why rents go up. Rents go up because it takes so long to get a tenant out. They go up because my operating expenses have gone up. They go up because my property taxes go up. It costs so much more to repair stuff. To even just replace something is 2 or 3 times what it was prior to 2020. So all expenses have increased. So it's sort of across the board. And if you need help finding who your elected officials are, also let me know. I'm happy to send you a link. You can search for them by town, and you can find out all the folks that are supposed to be representing your interests down in Montpelier. So
Absolutely. Well, it's 1 o'clock right on the money. Angela, I can't stress enough. Appreciate all and you and your team are doing for the landlords, property owners, property managers here. Again, folks, my name is Brian Armstrong, CEO of Keller Williams Vermont, Strongwell Property Management, and Strongwell Real Estate Team at KW. James, we always appreciate your additions, and can't stress enough, folks. If you've got a topic you'd like to help us cover, we'd love your input. Also be looking for our in-persons. We're going to be mixing these up to do some hybrids, some in-persons. Encourage you to join us in person. There's always, what I find about the in-persons that you don't get online is the unintended collaboration you get
Yes.
from another attendee.
Yes, it's
So
much more cooperative, and there's a lot more back and forth interaction.
And my request to everybody is please think about spending some time to speak down in Montpelier. In the very least, speak to the legislators so that we can better help protect the hardworking landlords who are providing housing in this great, beautiful, but housing challenged state.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We will hopefully get all of our Eventbrite Zoom issues sorted out for the next one.
Appreciate you, Angela. Thank you, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.